Well, the appearance of another film of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby gives us an opportunity to reflect on what many consider to be the great American novel. If you're looking for a real detailed review of the film, qua film, you might be disappointed. I like to reflect really more on the story that lies behind it. I will say this about the film. I think the Baz Luhrmann version is better than the sleepy 1974 version, and that Leonardo DiCaprio makes a better Gatsby than Robert Redford did. Um, but again, I think the story is what is most important here. As you know, Scott Fitzgerald belonged to that famously lost generation of writers and artists, people that came of age during the First World War, which is really the worst calamity, you could say, in human history. It was the most shocking calamity as Western civilization stumbled into this horrible crisis. These people witnessed it firsthand. They also witnessed the fact that no institution, political, cultural, religious, really was able to deal with this crisis. And it set many of these young men adrift. So it was Gertrude Stein who famously called them the lost generation. Most famously Hemingway, but also John Dos Passos and Ford Madox Ford. And F. Scott Fitzgerald belongs, of course, to that generation. Think of Hemingway, whom I love as a writer, but what you find in Hemingway is this fascination with edgy experiences, whether it's bullfighting or deep sea fishing or battling political opponents. And Hemingway had to put himself in these kind of limit situations to stir up a sense of life. It was his way of dealing with the collapse of meaning, the collapse of sort of moral and spiritual structure around that time. Well, Scott Fitzgerald, I think, becomes a chronicler, maybe the best chronicler, of another way that people handled the collapse of meaning. And that was to surrender to a life of conspicuous consumption. And The Great Gatsby is a very telling commentary on just that tendency. So you know the story well. It deals with Tom and Daisy Buchanan, who are denizens of East Egg, which is a little town on Long Island, where a lot of the old money resides. And these are people who have everything you could possibly want in terms of wealth. They've got the riches, they have servants, they have a beautiful home. There's a great scene in the new version of Gatsby where we meet them for the first time, and you see all the luxury that surrounds them. But there they are, really in utter boredom. There's another scene not long after that one. So Daisy sort of just falls into a languid, life of regret, and then her husband Tom is running off with all these sexual affairs with both people of the lower class and the upper class. There's a scene toward the beginning of the movie, which is basically a drunken orgy that takes place in a Manhattan apartment that Tom owns, and he invites a group of his friends, and they just spend the afternoon, drinking and carrying on and carousing. At the end of it, everybody who was involved in that drunken orgy are just listless and lifeless and unhappy. So we see that this picture of this life. Well, then we meet the main character of the novel and of the film, Gatsby himself. Gatsby lives in West Egg, just across the bay from East Egg, where some of the newer money resides. Gatsby is a grand figure. He wears flashy suits. He drives this yellow roadster. He lives in an even more impressive mansion than the Buchanans. And every Saturday night, he throws this magnificent party to which all the glitterati of New York are invited. We discover that the purpose of that party is to lure Daisy back. Daisy and he had had a relationship some years before. He's still pining after it, hoping to revive it, and hoping that he can lure this now married woman back into a relationship. The parties are maybe the highlight of the book and the movie, as they're this explosion of 1920s, music and jazz, and the 1920s outfits and the flappers and all this business. And you see this sort of wild expression of conspicuous consumption. Those are Gatsby's parties. Well, I won't go into any more details of the story, only to say that these people whose lives are utterly given over to the satisfaction of their sensual desires. The story ends disastrously with the death of Gatsby at the hands of a gunman. Here's the thing, though, about the story and why it matters for us today. F. Scott Fitzgerald himself knew that world well. I mean, he was a denizen of that world. He was famous for his drinking and his carousing. Nevertheless, I should say really, because of that, he becomes a great moral surveyor of that situation. He sees in a very clear-eyed way that what happens when morality, spirituality, a sense of transcendent purpose are lost, what happens is this corroding of the soul, which is apparent in every major character of The Great Gatsby. Even though he was himself a bit of a carouser, he's like a transcendently clear moralist when it comes to seeing what goes on. There's a town that lies in between West Egg and Manhattan, and the characters go back and forth through it all during the story. It's a kind of a burnt out, underdeveloped, economically depressed area. A lot of the poor people live there. And Scott Fitzgerald clearly is commenting on the sort of detritus of the Roaring Twenties. What made that high life possible was an awful lot of economic exploitation. So we're meant to see the kind of dark underbelly of American life at that time. But there's something more going on. Because right at the middle of that sort of burnt out town, there's the remains of a billboard. It was advertising an ophthalmologist. So it's all you see are a pair of eyes surrounded by these owlish glasses. But as the people go back and forth through the little town, the eyes are watching. Well, it doesn't take too much symbolic imagination to see that those eyes are symbolic of God. God who watches everything, who sees everything. Many people in the Roaring Twenties, as many people today, bracket God, marginalize God. There's no transcendent purpose. There's no moral absolute. All we should do is live our lives as kind of wildly and freely as we can. We should live our lives in conspicuous consumption. No, like it or not, believe it or not, God is watching. There is a transcendent purpose. There is a moral absolute. When you forget it, what happens are the lives of the characters in The Great Gatsby. So if you're tempted to say, oh, who needs God? I would say to you, watch this movie based upon a book that was written by a very clear-eyed moralist who preaches a very good sermon that is still worth hearing.